Chapter 22-21. She didn't know what the other side said, but Zhou Chongwang soon hung up the phone. He looked at Qin Mu and said lightly, "Your brother is in the company. He's fine. The company's doctor is waiting by his side. Don't worry." Qin Mu pursed her lips. She wanted to go over, but thinking of Zhou Chongwang, she gave up. She grabbed her phone and snorted, "Don't touch my phone in the future." "Why, is there any secret?" He smiled mysteriously. Qin Mu rolled her eyes at him and said, "If you want me to have it, I can have it too." As soon as she finished speaking, she was pulled into his arms. "Are you angry?" His voice was a little hoarse. "As a husband, I'm just declaring my sovereignty." She wanted to ridicule him, but he interrupted her. "Do you dare to say that Guze doesn't have feelings for you?" Qin Mu stared at him for a long time, then turned around and said, "You're bored." Zhou Chongwang followed behind her and grasped her hand, their fingers intertwined. He walked forward with her. She couldn't get rid of him, so she could only let him be. Qin Mu had never known that Zhou Chongwang was such a thick-skinned man. She had been blind before. "Mu, let me take you out to play," he suggested. Qin Mu looked a little disinterested. "It's getting late. I want to sleep. You've only slept for 3 hours. Mrs. Zhou, do you want to be a pig?" he said with a smile. "I insist on my right to have the best touch." Qin Mu couldn't communicate with him anymore. "Zhou Chongwang, why didn't I find that your mouth is so cheap?" Her tone was not very good. However, Zhou Chongwang had a good temper. He chuckled and said, "My body is even more cheap. Do you want to try?" When a man was shamelessly rubbing against you, it was impossible to refuse. Qin Mu reluctantly walked on the road with him, went to eat skewers, and even went to the bar to have some fun. In the end, Qin Mu drank a little too much and got drunk. Zhou Chongwang carried her on his back to the parking lot. It was a long way. In the late autumn night, with her little body behind his back and her arms around his neck, he felt as warm as a scarf. He had never felt such warmth in his heart. It was as if he had returned to the past. A young wife who wanted to divorce him gave him a sense of home. He had not had a family for a long time, but now, everything seemed to be complete again. He carried her on his back and coaxed in a low voice, "Mu Mu, who is the man you like at the moment? Right now?" Qin Mu lay lazily on his shoulder and narrowed her eyes. She really drank too much. "Now." Her voice was soft, and then she reached out and pinched his face. That was really painful. However, Zhou Chongwang was a little shameful and happy in his heart. He asked in a low voice, "Is it me?" Qin Mu was probably addicted to playing with him. She sat up straight and pinched his face with her little hands, twisting it around as if she was playing with a ball. This was the first time that Zhou Chongwang was in such a sorry state. He endured it for the answer he wanted to hear. When Qin Mu had enough, she leaned against his ear and laughed in a very low voice. That faint laughter went into his ear and was indescribably seductive. Just as he was about to lose control, Qin Mu bit him and said naughtily, "It won't be you." Chapter 22-22. He should have been angry. He had carried her on his back for so long, but she was still angry at him. But in his heart, there was only tenderness. He breathed lightly and said gently, "Qin Mu, then don't like anyone else, okay? Even if you hate someone, you only hate me, okay?" Qin Mu tilted her head, thought about it carefully, and nodded. "Okay." She reached out and grabbed his hand. "Then it's a deal. Well, but in this case, we will never be separated, so that you can hate me forever. Is that okay?" He teased her because she had drunk too much. Qin Mu nodded. "We will never be separated. I will think of ways to torture you every day." She must have thought of something interesting as she giggled. She looked really cute. Zhou Chongwang suddenly put her down and kissed her on the street in the middle of the night. He hugged her tightly, as if he was hugging his whole life, as if he wanted to integrate her into his bones and blood. He knew that she was the one he wanted. The dream was still a dream, and she was the real person who had been with him for 8 years. "Mu Mu." He kissed her until she couldn't breathe. Finally, he loosened his grip a little and looked at her seriously. "Don't leave me." She didn't answer and just looked at him blankly. That expression was something that only the 14-year-old Qin Mu could have. That year, He didn't take her, and sometimes he regretted it. But tonight, he seemed to have returned to the past. The man's hatred was vividly displayed at this moment. Zhou Chengwang carried her and walked to the parking lot. 5 minutes later, he put her in the back seat of the car. Qin Mu was a little sober. "I want to sit in the front." "Good girl." He coaxed her, sat in the car, and closed the door. The dark and narrow space was a little cramped, mixed with the smell of alcohol and his breath. Although Qin Mu was drunk, she could guess what he wanted to do. She licked her lips nervously and shook her head. "I don't want in the car." But he was already kissing her, as if he was determined to do it. Qin Mu took advantage of the fact that she was drunk and cried desperately. She didn't care if anyone outside could hear her. She was crying and kicking him, but he really couldn't do anything to her. Zhou Chengwang was also very distressed. He frowned and kissed her comfortingly. "Moo, it'll be fine in a while." He knew she wasn't used to it, but he couldn't stand it anymore. He kissed her and coaxed her, but she still cried. In the end, he could only cover her little mouth, not letting her make a sound. Qin Mu was no match for him, and he still managed to burn himself in the car once. An hour later, Zhou Chengwang let go of her and said in a hoarse voice, Moo, are you okay?" She kicked him. "Get lost," she said with a hint of sobbing in her voice. "I hate you the most." She said she hated him, but he wasn't angry. He kissed her little neck and coaxed her. "But you said you liked me just now." "I didn't." Qin Mu's face was a little hot, and she denied it without confidence. Zhou Chengwang smiled, sat up, and pulled her into his arms. Then he took out his cell phone and played a recording for her. Qin Mu's face suddenly changed. Chapter 22-23. Qin Mu glared at him. "Zhou Chengwang, you're despicable." He didn't care about her angry stare and continued to play the recording calmly. Qin Mu wanted to grab it, but she forgot that she was in a mess. She fell into his arms, which was exactly what he wanted. He threw the phone aside and kissed her in his arms. Qin Mu couldn't struggle and could only be held in his arms. When he was finally done kissing her, he pressed his beautiful thin lips against her little mouth and chuckled. "If you want to divorce me again, I'll send this recording out. Let's see who else dares to want you, okay?" Qin Mu glared at him, but she didn't have any power at all. Zhou Chengwang smiled, held her with one hand, and put on her clothes with the other. "I'll wear it myself," Qin Mu said. On the one hand, she was angry, but on the other hand, she was a little uncomfortable. They had been husband and wife for so many years, but after they had sex, they seemed to wash their own clothes and didn't have much intimacy, let alone take care of her like he did now. However, Zhou Chengwang insisted on doing this. His voice was low and hoarse. "Be good, don't move." He reached out and firmly helped her put on her clothes, while Qin Mu curled up like a shrimp in his arms. Zhou Chengwang had never thought that she was so beautiful and cute. How many years had he missed? Although he couldn't calm down, his tone was still indifferent. "Are you going home?" Qin Mu didn't say anything. She hugged her body and rolled to the side. He knew that she wasn't used to this, so he put on his clothes and climbed into the driver's seat. As he fastened his seatbelt, he said slowly, "This kind of thing will happen often in the future. You have to get used to it." Qin Mu was furious. He was really shameless. She threw a pillow at him, but it didn't hit him. Zhou Chengwang chuckled, as if teasing her was a very happy thing. When he started the car, he suddenly remembered that when she mentioned the divorce, she had said that he was dirty. Thinking of this, his throat was a little blocked. After a long time, he said in a muffled voice, "Mu, forget about the past, okay?" Qin Mu didn't say anything. She just hugged her knees and looked at the dark night outside. It was a big change that she didn't refuse. He didn't force her, but his heart was sour, sweet, heavy, and heavy. He wanted to vent all kinds of emotions, but he couldn't do that. He was afraid that he would scare her. He wanted to take it slow. Back at the villa, the warm yellow light illuminated every inch of the living room, and the piano by the floor-to-ceiling window was opened again. He sat in front of her and played to Alice for her over and over again, to her over and over again. He said that he would play until she was willing to come back to him. Late at night, Qin Mu finally couldn't take it anymore. He sprawled on the armrest of the sofa and fell asleep. At the night, Qin Mu Qin Mu, Qin at Mu. He, Qin, Shun, Sheng, Xing Mu. At the end of the song, he closed the lid of the piano, got up, and walked toward her. He leaned over and kissed her little face, then stared at her quietly. Qin Mu was very beautiful. As she grew older, she became more and more mature, very much like Yuliangqiu back then. One must know that back then, Yuliangqiu had stunned the entire world, but his Mu had only stunned time. He didn't want his wife to show her face in public, and he didn't want her to go out and be seen by other men. It was also because of his selfishness that the reality show ended without any success in the end. Chapter 22-24. This feeling was different from the feeling he had for Tangshare when he was young. At that time, he was young and full of vigor, but now that he had experienced everything, he should have passed the age of hot-bloodedness, but he was still like this. He leaned into her ear and said in a low and hoarse voice, Mu, let's start over, okay? He had asked this question many times, and only she would not refuse him when she was asleep. As he spoke, he smiled and pressed his face against her little face, whispering sweet nothings in a low and hoarse voice. How could there be a day when I like you so much? If I had known, Mu, I wouldn't have hurt you like that. He reached out to pick her up and went straight upstairs. In the end, he carried her to her bedroom. Zhou Chongwang bent his legs, half knelt beside her, and helped her change into her pajamas. When he did all this, it was not that he did not touch Yunyan, but he was concerned about her mood and that she should be very tired, so he could not bear to torture her again. After covering Qin Mu with a blanket, he looked at her for a long time before dimming the bedside lamp and leaving. When the door closed, Qin Mu slowly opened her eyes. She looked at the boundless night and pursed her lips. Her heart was not unshaken. After all, for 4 or 5 years, she had given Zhou Chongwang her purest teenage years. She had loved this man so passionately. At this moment, he was pursuing her. It would be a lie to say that she was not tempted at all. However, Qin Mu knew that she had to hold on to the last line. She could no longer completely give herself to a man like before. She did not want to be hurt again, not at all. Qin Mu reached out to hug herself and let herself fall into the darkness. That night, Yi Miyun stood in the top-floor office of Boyi, with Gu Zhe by his side. Mr. Yi, things have changed a little. Gu Zhe's voice was solemn. I haven't taken action yet, but a media outlet has exposed on the internet that ANN's work, Rainy Night, is a plagiarism of the famous Chinese artist Lan Yu's masterpiece Cloudy Sky. Yi Miyun stared at Gu Zhe for a long time before he said, Show me the picture of that painting online. Gu Zhe pulled out a picture from his phone, which was obviously prepared in advance. Yi Miyun took a look and frowned deeply. He knew that with Cher's personality, she would never plagiarize his work. However, the two paintings were so similar, and their souls were so compatible. It would be too much of a coincidence if they had never met before. Yi Miyun narrowed his eyes with a solemn expression. Gu Zhe hesitated for a moment and asked, Mr. Yi, do you want to solve this problem for Cher? He wants to find Lan Yu and solve it in private. As long as Lan Yu doesn't sue or even comes out to explain, it won't cause any trouble. Yi Miyun didn't answer him immediately. Instead, he walked quietly to the floor-to-ceiling window. He stood there and looked at the dark night outside. After a long time, he said softly, Gu Zhe, search for Lan Yu again and see his information. Gu Zhe was stunned. He had been with Yi Miyun for many years, so he could usually guess what Yi Miyun was thinking. Gu Zhe took the notebook and quickly searched for Lan Yu on Baidu Baiki. A long list of information came out. Gu Zhe was stunned when he saw it. Chapter 22-25. He was very thin and tall. His facial features were different from those of pure Asian men. They were very three-dimensional, and his eyes were amber. In short, he was a young and very good-looking man. Gu Zhe said softly, Mr. Yi, I found him. Very young, isn't he? Yi Miyun's voice was very indifferent, and he didn't turn around. Gu Zhe didn't know how to answer. After a long time, he softly replied, Gu Zhe, tell me, what kind of relationship do you think they have? Yi Miyun closed his eyes. Don't investigate. Let things develop. Gu Zhe's emotions fluctuated slightly. He stood behind Yun and didn't say anything. He just accompanied him to watch the dark night outside. After standing there for a long time, Yun said softly, "Guze, do you feel lonely standing so high?" Guze couldn't answer. He used to think that climbing to the highest place was his life's dream. But now he stood there, but he didn't feel a trace of excitement. His heart was left at that place by the sea. He didn't speak for a long time. Yun stood there, his slender hand supporting his forehead. His voice became even lower. "Guze, even if we know that we're lonely, there's no turning back." As he said that, he slowly turned his head and looked at Guze with a smile. "Let's go for a drink, how about it?" Guze closed his eyes slightly and let out a long breath. Okay. The two of them went downstairs together and drove their respective sports cars to the bar called Night Color. Because each of them had their own thoughts, they didn't control themselves. After an hour, they were almost drunk, but only to the point of being slightly drunk. Because after drinking, some words could be said, especially for Guze. The words that had been suppressed for so long, the words that couldn't be said, could be said at this time. At this time, he took 10 cans of beer outside and sat on the rooftop, enjoying the night wind. After finishing a can, he crushed it and threw it far away. Guze turned his face and fixed his eyes on Yimmuyu. 8 years ago, you sacrificed Cher for Chinmu. This time, are you going to sacrifice Chinmu for Cher? Yimmuyu just looked at him quietly. Guze laughed mockingly. He leaned back and placed his hands on the concrete floor. He raised his head and casually unbuttoned 2 buttons on his shirt. You clearly know that Zhou Chengwang isn't Chinmu's lover. They will always have problems when they are together. Zhou Chengwang is on a whim now, and his whole heart is with Chinmu. But what about in the future? He said firmly, "If he hurts Chinmu again, have you thought about the consequences?" Yimmuyu said calmly, "Zhou Chengwang's sincerity is to transfer 20% of King Entertainment's shares to Chinmu." Guze was stunned. Yimmuyu patted his shoulder. "I'm not the kind of brother who doesn't care about Chinmu's life. I just feel that it's better to leave with a broken heart. Otherwise, with Chinmu's temper, she probably won't be satisfied. She wouldn't be satisfied, probably because of Gume." Guze let out a long sigh. "So you think Zhou Chengwang is your true love? I'm willing to give him a chance." Yimmuyu said fairly. "This has nothing to do with me and Cher." Guze smiled and directly lay on the cold concrete floor, looking up at the stars. "Then why don't you consider me?" he murmured, his eyes a little warm. Chapter 22-26. Guze looked up and smiled bitterly. Yes, I can't do it. He might have been able to do it in the past, but he couldn't do it now. He had given up on Gume once and let her go to jail. He really couldn't do it again. Yimmuyu lay down and looked at the starry sky with Guze. The two men suddenly looked at each other and smiled. "Find a woman to marry." Yimmuyu patted his shoulder and stood up unsteadily. He walked toward the exit while Guze lay there without moving. After a long time, he covered his face with his hand, his Adam's apple moving uncontrollably. At the bottom of the building, Yimmuyu walked out of the elevator with his coat in his hand. Standing at the bottom of the building, he suddenly had a feeling that he didn't know where to go. He didn't drive and just kept walking. Before he knew it, he had reached the entrance of GM Hotel. She had returned to B City and should be back at the hotel now. Yimmuyu raised his head and looked at the bright signboard of GM for a long time before finally walking in. The receptionist naturally recognized him, but she was still very surprised because Mr. Yi had always been noble. When did he become like this? A few buttons on his shirt were unbuttoned and the cuffs were rolled up to his elbows. They were a little wrinkled and his coat was even a little gray. The receptionist was busy staring at him. Yimmuyun's voice was very calm. "Has Miss Tang returned to the hotel?" "Miss Tang?" The receptionist was stunned for a moment before she understood what he meant. She thought for a moment and quickly said, "She just returned to the hotel. She should be in her room now. Don't call her." His voice was low and full of warning. How could the receptionist offend this man? Boy was now under the management of Mr. Yi and President Tang. You almost didn't care about anything. However, she found it strange that Mr. Yi and Miss Tang had broken up for so many years, but Mr. Yi was still in Boyi, like a son-in-law. It was really amazing. With that, Yi Muyun walked towards the elevator. As he stood in the elevator, his mind went blank. All that was left was Gu Zhe's words. Wang Yu was quite good-looking and very young, but he didn't want to look. Instinctively, he didn't want to look. He was waiting for the final result. Unless Cher brought that man to him, he didn't want to look at that man. The elevator went all the way down and stopped at the top floor with a ding. Yi Muyun stepped out of the elevator and walked 2 steps to the door of her suite. This was the place where they had intercourse countless times. Earlier on, she had even taken her here, and she was still living here. If she still loved him, then what was that man? Yi Muyun walked to the door, but he didn't knock immediately. Instead, he smoked a cigarette. After he finished smoking, he reached out and knocked on the door, avoiding the peephole. Cher thought it was room service, so she didn't suspect anything and opened the door. She was wearing a bathrobe, so she must have just taken a shower. As soon as she opened the door, her slender arms were pulled into an embrace by a pair of strong hands. Then, her body was pressed against the hard door, and her head was firmly pressed against it. Then, hot lips blocked her little mouth. She struggled instinctively, but he didn't let go of her. He pressed her fiercely, one long leg directly stuck in her, lifting up and holding her body in place. Chapter 22-27. Just like that, they kissed for a long time without a care in the world. Finally, she was exhausted and gave up struggling. Her body went limp and was at his mercy. Yi Muyun nibbled on her neck and buried his burning face in her neck. He said in a deep voice, "Tell me, what happened to you in the past 8 years?" Her body jerked and her legs went limp. If it wasn't for him holding her up, she would have slipped down long ago. Why? Scared? He looked up slightly and held her face with his slender fingers. However, his gaze was cold. "You don't dare to say it?" Cher pursed her lips and said in a low voice after a long time, "It has nothing to do with you. Yi Muyun, we broke up a long time ago. It was 8 years ago. Have you forgotten?" He took a step back. Her legs finally went limp and her body slid down. She hurriedly held onto the door behind her to prevent herself from falling. Right now, she wouldn't allow herself to fall in front of him. That's right. Broke up? He suddenly walked up and pinched her delicate chin with his strong hand. His voice was so cold that it was like ice. "Tang Cher, who said that we broke up, His strength seemed as though he was going to crush her bones. Cher held onto the door behind her and tried her best to resist the pain. She looked pathetic and tears welled up in her eyes. If it was in the past, how could he bear to do this to her? But now, anger and uneasiness made him lose his rationality. There was only a crazy thought in his mind, and that was to lock her up and not let her go anywhere or let anyone find her. Cher looked at his expression and was a little shocked. He was crazy. She swallowed her saliva with difficulty and said stubbornly, "We broke up. Have you forgotten? Have you forgotten Song Karen's existence?" She was never a problem. He growled at her. "I didn't touch her." As he said that, he bit down on the soft flesh behind her ear as though he was venting his anger. She cried out in pain, but he didn't let her off. His voice turned colder. "Tell me, have there been any men who have treated you like this all these years?" Cher couldn't take it anymore. She bit her lip and said, "Yi Muyun, you bastard." His expression was extremely ugly as he stared at her and sneered, "Am I a bastard? Then I'll show you the bastard side of me." As he said that, he kissed her lips fiercely again. At the same time, he did many things to her with his large palms. She struggled with all her might, but to no avail. Her bathrobe slid down to her shoulders soon. There were a few bite marks on her smooth shoulders, all of them stained with blood. He had never treated her like this before. She was in so much pain that she almost fainted, and he even wanted to take her right in front of the door. At the critical moment, the elevator chimed. The room attendant held her tray and stared blankly at the erotic scene in front of her. She didn't know what to do. One was Mr. Yi, and the other was the young Miss of Boyi. It was obvious that the young miss had been forced to do it because she had bitten so hard that she was bleeding. The attendant pursed her lips and didn't dare to make a sound for a long time. She just stood there in a daze. Yi Muyun finally realized the existence of a third party. He hugged Cher and growled, "Get lost." The attendant's heart skipped a beat, and she immediately took the elevator and left. Chapter 22-28. Her eyes were filled with tears. "I don't owe you anything." All of his movements came to an abrupt halt. His face was buried in her neck as his breathing was hot and messy. Just like that, he buried himself in her neck for a long time before saying in a low and bitter voice, "Yes, you don't owe me anything." Slowly, he let go of her and took 2 steps back. But his gaze did not let go of her as he looked at her with an unfathomable depth. Cher's body was trying her best to hold on, her eyes filled with tears as she looked up at him. Her expression was deep but not overbearing, yet it was moving. But he did not know if it belonged to him alone. At that moment, he really wanted to ask her who Lan Yu was and what was his relationship with her. But a man's pride and the fact that he had loved her for so many years made him unable to ask. "I'm sorry, I drank too much." He stroked his forehead with his slender fingers and chuckled. "Sorry to have offended you." Cher's eyes were wide open like a frightened rabbit. Her face was pale, and she looked so weak that she could collapse at any moment. Yi Muyun smiled again. It was a very faint smile as he stepped back into the elevator. The elevator door closed, blocking their line of sight. At that moment, his face darkened. Her little face, too, became even more sorrowful and fragile. When Yi Muyun reached downstairs, he did not leave immediately. Instead, he sat down on the sofa in the lobby. Because of his presence, the manager on duty walked over with small steps. "Mr. Yi, do you have any instructions?" Yi Muyun held a cigarette and smoked lightly. After smoking half a cigarette, he said, "Get someone to send the food up." The manager knew where to send the food, so he said with a solemn expression, "We will do it even if Mr. Yi doesn't say it." That soul-stirring scene from earlier had already spread throughout the GM. The love entanglement between Chairman Yi and their family's young mistress was still unsettled. Wasn't there someone called Song Karen? In the end, when Missy came back, she could not even be considered as cannon fodder and was sent flying. Come to think of it, Mr. Yi only had eldest miss in his heart. That made sense. Back then, the golden boy and Jade girl were the envy of countless people. After the manager finished speaking, he wanted to take care of it himself. Yi Muyun sat there alone and didn't leave. He felt a little tired, and all the muscles in his body ached. He wanted to rest. Only when he laid down did he feel that lying down was so comfortable. Only then did he realize that he hadn't really had a good rest all these years. Because all these years, he had been waiting for her to the point where he couldn't sleep at night. He was lying on the bed with his shoes on and his coat casually tossed aside. Moreover, he was drunk. He was really down and out. The receptionist whispered to each other, "Is Mr. Yi fighting with the little devil upstairs again?" "Isn't that right?" The other said quietly. "If you ask me, Mr. Yi will give in the end." "Why?" The previous receptionist didn't understand. "I remember that scary Mr. Yi upstairs. When I saw him, I would be like a mouse seeing a cat. Mr. Yi is really authoritative." The other one snorted softly. If he was authoritative, he wouldn't be drunk here. Although Mr. Yi didn't look happy for the past 8 years, when did he ever look so pathetic? The other one was convinced immediately. That's also. Chapter 22-29. Don't. It's better if you catch a cold. The one upstairs will be heartbroken when he comes down tomorrow. She had to admit that the GM's front desk was full of drama. Just like that, Yi Muyun lay in the lobby of the hotel for the whole night. Early in the morning, Cher got up and went for a jog as usual. When she passed by the lobby, she paused for a moment because she saw Yi Muyun. She slowed down and looked at him quietly for a while before walking to the front desk. "Why is Mr. Yi lying here? Didn't he go home?" The receptionist was still the same as last night. She was about to get off work. "It's because Mr. Yi insisted on sleeping here and refused to go back home." Cher glanced at them and said calmly as she walked out, "Call Vice President Gu and ask him to pick him up." The receptionist gave her a perfect smile. Vice President Gu probably drank too much last night. Now, he's probably sleeping on the road. Cher turned back and looked at the receptionist. She shook her head and didn't say anything in the end. They could sleep wherever they wanted. She wore a set of white sportswear and walked out of the hotel, ready to jog for half an hour. But as soon as she walked out, a large group of reporters surrounded the door, holding up their interview placards and asking questions. Miss Tang, your work, Rainy Night, has been reported as plagiarizing the popular artist Lan Yu's Cloudy Sky. How do you explain this? Miss Tang, the public opinion is very unfavorable to you. Will this ruin the reputation of ANN, a rising star? Miss Tang, you're the only heir of Boy. Why did you do such a shameless thing like plagiarism? The reporters surrounded her as if they had gone crazy, wishing that every inch of her flesh and blood could be used as gossip to exchange for benefits. If it was the Cher from 8 years ago, she would probably shrink back. But she was different today. Her petite body was drowned in a large crowd, but she didn't panic at all. Instead, she said calmly, "What evidence do you have to prove that I plagiarized?" Everyone was silent because no one had expected her to ask such a question in such a righteous manner. Amidst the silence, a female reporter displayed her extraordinary fearlessness and straightforwardly said, "Based on the scenery and artistic conception of these two paintings, Miss Tang, do you think you could deny it? Not many people know that I'm Miss Tang and I'm a member of ANN. Who ordered you to do this?" Cher chuckled. "No matter who reported it, did Mr. Lan Yu come forward to testify against me?" Silence reigned once more. What kind of identity did Lan Yu have? He was an internationally renowned artist. Why would he come to be city so easily? Miss Tang, you probably think it doesn't matter because of your family background, but I want to tell you that art is sacred and inviolable. The female reporter didn't want to give up. Cher was very clear in her heart that she was probably Song Karen's person, guiding the direction of a group of people's opinions. She only smiled faintly. Really? Then what do you think I should do? Apologize to Mr. Lan Yu and prove that I'm guilty of plagiarism? The female reporter's face turned red. Shouldn't that be the case? Chapter 22:30. As she spoke, she looked straight at the female reporter. "Tell your boss that I am ANN, and also Tang Shui. If she wants to touch me, she has to weigh her own weight first." The female reporter's face turned pale and then red. The other reporters were shocked too. When they came, they were like sharks that smell blood. When they left, they were a little dispirited. Cher looked at the direction where they left. She knew that things wouldn't end just like that, because some people wouldn't give up. If she couldn't do it openly, she would do it secretly. She pursed her lips and dialed a number. When she picked it up, her gaze became gentle. "Lan Yu, is Shu there?" The voice on the other side was very elegant. "He's asleep." After a pause, he continued to ask, "When will he be back?" Cher bit her lips and said after a long time, "There's some trouble, so it might be delayed for a few days." "Is it that rainy night?" His voice was very calm. "Do you need me to show up?" Cher was stunned and immediately shook her head. No need. She was just bluffing and didn't really want him to show up. The other side was silent for a while before saying, "Come back soon. Ishu misses you very much." Cher grunted in acknowledgement and slowly put down the phone. A few meters behind her, Yimyun looked at her quietly. His face was pale, almost without a trace of blood. He couldn't hear it clearly, but he heard that her voice was very gentle. She would only talk like this when she was talking to someone she was familiar with. He was sure that that person was Lan Yu. What kind of relationship did they have to be able to draw the same painting and have a compatible soul? When Cher turned around, she saw him. She also saw his pale face and the impending storm. Did he hear it? She bit her lips and didn't say anything. He didn't either. The two of them looked at each other quietly with their own pride. She thought that he would get angry eventually, but he didn't. He just looked at her for a long, long time before he turned and left. 2 hours later, Yimyun entered the VIP ward of Xinyuan Hospital. Guze dragged his hungover body and was summoned over. When he entered, he was also slightly shocked. Mystery didn't drink much last night. How did he end up with a perforated stomach? He almost died. After the surgery, he was as pale as a sheet of paper, but he was conscious. Guze sat beside him and sighed. "Mr. Yi, what do you want me to do?" The truth was clear now. Cher's relationship with Lan Yu wasn't an ordinary one. Moreover, Mr. Yi was such a proud man. Would he not be able to take it? Or did you settle it for her and let her go? Guzay asked softly, because at that moment, he really couldn't figure out what Yi Muyun was thinking and what kind of decision he would make. After he said that, Yi Muyun's voice was a little soft. Guzay, in your heart, you always feel that I've let her down, don't you? Guzay couldn't say it out loud. Among them, the biggest victim of what happened 8 years ago was Tang Sher. Everyone knew that Mr. Yi didn't want to admit it because he didn't want to let go. If he said that he hated her, he would have more reason to pester her. If he said that he had let her down, why would he pester her? Chapter 22:31. That was what Guzay thought in his heart. Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes and continued. If she really fell in love with someone else, why would she be willing to sleep with me? Guzay hadn't opened his mouth yet. Moreover, he couldn't say such a private thing. However, Mr. Yi was too thick-skinned. How could he say such a thing? Yi Muyun's eyes were burning. She wasn't forced. She enjoyed it, and she would take the initiative. Guzay sighed in his heart. Mr. Yi, you look like this, and you both have a past. If you insist on doing it, which woman can refuse? That's a woman's normal physiological reaction, okay? However, it was understandable that Cher still had lingering feelings for Mr. Yi. However, men could eat what was in the pot and look at what was in the bowl, but women couldn't. Moreover, she could make a trip to B City, get some stock, and then return to America. She still had a handsome husband waiting for her. It wasn't a loss at all. Guzay thought in frustration in his heart. He only dared to think about it, but he didn't dare to say it out loud. What do you mean, Mr. Yi? He had to ask anyway. What should he do? He couldn't just pretend that nothing had happened. Could he? Yi Muyun looked at Guzay and said very softly, lead the major media to prove that she plagiarized. Guzay was slightly surprised. He really didn't dare to think about it. He hesitated for a moment. Mr. Yi, if Cher finds out, she probably won't forgive you. Yi Muyun lay quietly, his eyes looking at the white ceiling of the ward. On his face, there was nothing but weakness. Then he said something that made Guzay's heart jump. If she isn't with me, then why do I need her forgiveness? Guzay was speechless. After a long silence, he said, I understand. Yi Muyun nodded and casually took a cigarette from the bedside table. He wanted to smoke, but was stopped by Guzay. He pinched the cigarette in half and threw it away. He also confiscated the entire pack of cigarettes. Do you want to die? Smoking right after the surgery? After a pause, he continued, they just spoil you too much. Yi Muyun did not resist. He continued to stare at the ceiling. After a long time, he let out a long sigh. Guzay, I am so cruel to you. Why do you still follow me? He tilted his head. I know that with your current ability, it's very easy for you to go out and become a CEO. Why do you have to submit to others? Guzay said faintly, that wasn't Mr. Ye's fault. It was Gu Mei's fault. As Gu Mei's brother, he just happened to fall in love with Qin Mu. He had not reached the point where he couldn't live without Qin Mu. Although Mr. Yi couldn't live without Tang Sher, at least his soul was gone. What was alive was just an empty shell. Yi Muyun closed his eyes gently. Don't tell anyone that I'm hospitalized. Guzay understood what he meant. He quickly went out and arranged for someone to take care of him. Guzay's heart trembled a little when he did this, because he needed too much. But because of his operation, Cher's matter became a big deal. The mainstream media no longer had any scruples and reported it desperately. There were even people speculating that all this was instigated by Mr. Yi and that Boy Yi was pressuring him. Because of a painting, there was an uproar. But the CEO of Boy Yi, Mr. Tang Yu, was abroad and had not come back. He did not clarify and let the little girl make a fuss, which was really puzzling. Chapter 22:32. In the next few days, the comments outside became more and more intense. Coupled with Song Karen's slanderous words, ANN's reputation went from being a rising star in the art world to a shameful plagiarist. The reporters outside the GM hotel were simply waiting, and they had no intention of leaving for 3 days and 3 nights. The security guards of the GM hotel tried many times, but they couldn't get rid of them. Cher had been in the hotel for 3 days and hadn't gone out at all. Once she went out, she was surrounded by reporters. She was also getting more and more panicked because she knew that in such a situation, only someone could make the mainstream media speak out. It must be someone powerful. And Song Karen didn't have such ability, nor did she have such courage. Cher didn't look for her, but went to the headquarters of Boyi. She drove a fully enclosed black sports car from the underground parking lot and got out without a hitch. The car stopped at the entrance of Boyi, and she found that there were also many reporters there. No matter how good Cher's temper was, she still cursed and opened the door to get out. Before she came, she had already informed the security guards, so when she appeared, the reporters were blocked by the security guards. She came over and didn't tell Yi Mu-yoon that it was Guze who received her. Guze was different from the mess he was the other day. He was wearing a decent handmade suit and stood there with a smile. Mr. Yi is not in the company now. Cher pushed him away and said angrily, "I don't believe it." With that, she went straight to the elevator. Guze wasn't annoyed. He followed behind her slowly and went upstairs together. If he lost a little girl, how could he climb up? As soon as they reached the top floor, Cher kicked open Yi Mu-yoon's office. Yi Mu-yoon come out. But the office was quiet, and there were a lot of documents on the desk. It was obvious that he hadn't been in the office for a few days. "I said that Mr. Yi is not in, but you didn't believe me." Guze's tone was gentle. "How about this? I'll ask my secretary to make you a cup of coffee and rest here for a while. If there's anything, I can solve it." Cher looked at him coldly. "If Yi Mu-yoon didn't give the order, would you dare to do it?" Guze rubbed his nose. "All right, but Mr. Yi is not here. He's in the hospital." Shuai pursed her lips and dashed towards the elevator. She was in a rush. Guze touched his nose again and smiled. The little girl's temper has grown a lot over the years. "Sigh, I feel sorry for the sick Mr. Yi. I wonder how he'll be tormented later." Guze smiled and went downstairs with her. In the end, he got into his car and drove her to the hospital. Vice President Gu would never admit that she purposely went to watch the show. On the road, Cher didn't say a word. Guze wanted to tease her, but failed. In the end, he sighed and said, "Cher, when did we become so distant?" Shua tilted her head and looked at him. Suddenly, she laughed coldly. "Guze, are you wooing me?" Then, she smiled even colder and said darkly, "How about this? Let's go to the hospital together now and tell Yi Mu-yoon that you like me and want to be with me. How about that?" Guze's hand that was holding the steering wheel fluttered, and then the sports car swayed on the road. He quickly held it steady and then returned to the right track. He coughed and said, "This joke isn't very funny. He would probably be skinned alive." Chapter 2233. Guze didn't say a word. All right, only Mr. Yi could take the blame for this. He sent Cher to Xingyuan Hospital and went to park the car. Cher went up first. She knew that he would be staying in the VIP ward, so she went straight up. Everyone in the hospital, from the director to the nurses, knew her. When they saw her, they naturally thought of Mr. Yi. Was Miss Tang here to visit Mr. Yi? That should be the case, right? But Miss Tang's expression didn't seem to indicate it. Hence, no one dared to make a sound. They all retreated to the sides and watched as Miss Tang opened the VIP ward like a goddess of vengeance. At that moment, everyone was praying for Mr. Yi, hoping that Mr. Yi would be able to pull through. When Cher opened the door, Yi Mu-yoon was sitting on the bed. There was an A4 in his arm, and he was reading a Bible in his other hand. When he saw Cher, he smiled faintly. "Why? You're here to visit a patient? But shouldn't you bring something to visit a patient?" Cher stood at the door, her face tense. "Mr. Yi is reading the Bible. Is it because you've done too many bad things, and so you need some peace of mind?" Yi Mu-yoon looked at her calmly and smiled faintly. "Mr. Yi, I remember that we just had sex not long ago, and we did it several times in one night. Now you're calling me Mr. Yi. Huh?" Cher's face tensed up even more. "All right, Yi Mu-yoon, does this show our relationship?" He remained seated and looked at her indifferently. "You're the one who got the media to chase after that painting on that rainy night and plagiarizing it, aren't you?" Her voice was cold. Yi Mu-yoon's eyes darkened. He looked at her calmly for a long time before he smiled faintly. "What do you think?" She was stunned. She hadn't expected such an answer. However, she was used to fooling around in front of him. Now that she was tricked by him, she was so angry that she reached out and pulled out his foredrip. Immediately, beads of blood appeared on the back of his hand and seeped down one by one. Cher was a little frightened. Although she was so fierce before, she was also frightened at this moment. Why can't the bleeding stop? She stared at him with a pale face, unable to react for a moment. She just stared blankly. After a long time, she finally remembered and immediately wanted to run away, but he reached out and caught her. Cher bit her lips and struggled with all her might, but his grip was firm. However, when he exerted force, the blood on the back of his hand seeped out even more. What? You want to run away after doing something bad? There was no smile in his eyes. He threw the Bible into her arms and said, "You should read this." Cher bit her lip and lowered her head to look at the back of his bleeding hand. She whispered, "I'll call the nurse." His voice suddenly raised a few octaves. "Tang Cher, do I still have a place in your heart?" She was stunned. Slowly, she looked up at him. Yi Muyun's eyes had a tinge of bitterness. "If I didn't ask this, you wouldn't have come to the hospital to see me, right?" His face was pale. He grabbed her hand and looked deeply into her eyes. Cher bit her lip the entire time, unable to say anything. He had come over in a threatening manner, but now it was all gone. It was all because he was bleeding. Chapter 2234. There's no need. His gaze was burning. My injury isn't on my hand, but here. His finger gently pointed at his heart. It's here, but you can't see it. She couldn't say a single word and could only stare at him like that. Tang Cher, don't you have anything to say to me? His voice had a tinge of desolation that could simply penetrate her soul. She suddenly felt flustered and felt that she had come to the wrong place. No matter whether he was the one who did it or not, she shouldn't have come. But she couldn't break free. His strength seemed to have been waiting for her. She was embarrassed and annoyed, but at the same time, she was sure that he was the one who did it. She said angrily, "Yi Muyun, you're too despicable." "Is loving you despicable?" he said weakly but straightforwardly. Cher pursed her lips. "Loving someone is fulfilling their wish. Fulfilling your wish with someone else?" His voice became extremely cold. Tang Cher. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, not caring if his wound hurt or not. He said in a deep voice, "Tang Cher, don't even think about it." Their eyes met. His eyes were filled with indignation and anger that completely surpassed hers. Her expression was extremely helpless, as though she would always be that weak little girl in front of him. She had never changed. At this moment, Guzet pushed the door open and entered. The moment he entered, he saw that the scene inside was a little bloody. He held his forehead and smiled helplessly. In the end, he turned around and called the nurse over. "Reattach the drip for Mr. Yi." In the ward, Yi Muyun was still locking Cher's hand and didn't let go. It was almost as if he was stubborn. When the nurse came, she said carefully, "Mr. Yi, please give me your right hand." But Yi Muyun only gave her his left hand. His gaze was still on Cher's face, and his voice was extremely indifferent. "Hang this hand." The young nurse had no choice but to do as she was told. She lowered her head and carefully hung it up for him. Guzet wanted to watch the show, but in the end, he didn't come in. Instead, he chose to stand outside. The nurse was the same. She ran out as soon as she was done with her work, as if there was a ghost behind her. In the ward, Cher's voice was clear and cold. "Mr. Yi should be tired. I won't bother you anymore." However, he held her in his arms with one hand and buried his face in her neck. As if venting his anger, he bit her hard. "Tang Cher, you tried to escape again, aren't you?" "I didn't." She sighed softly. "I didn't. Yi Muyun, I've said that I don't owe you anything in the past, and I still don't owe you anything." He suddenly let go of her and looked at her as if she was a stranger. After a long time, he chuckled. "Yes, you don't owe me anything. Is that why you feel at ease?" She couldn't answer him because the relationship between her and Lan Yu wasn't what he thought it was. However, she didn't want to explain, and she couldn't. She just lowered her little face and smiled faintly and helplessly. "I don't feel at ease. If Mr. Yu wants to hear an apology, I can say it." After you say it, you can let me go, right? There was a hint of exasperation in his voice. Cher's lips trembled slightly. After a long time, she said yes. Chapter 22:35. He leaned back, picked up a cigarette with his bloody hand, and said faintly, "Let's go." As he leaned there, Cher found that his hospital gown was also stained with blood. She still couldn't leave immediately. Instead, she pursed her lips and said softly, "I'll call the nurse." "I won't die," he said indifferently. "Tang Cher, if you don't intend to look back, don't pretend to care about me." His voice was cold. "You should care more about yourself or Lan Yu." When she heard him say Lan Yu's name, her body shook and her lips trembled slightly. Finally, she stood up and walked straight out. When she walked out of the ward, she heard a violent sound behind her and even the sound of something heavy falling. She pursed her lips. Childish. But as soon as she said that, she wanted to cry. She bit her lip and held back her tears for a long time. A pair of big hands patted her on the shoulder, and then it was Gu Zhe's gentle voice. "Did you quarrel?" Shui'er's eyes reddened as she looked at Gu Zhe. He was still as gentle as before. It seemed that time had not changed much on him, but she knew that he had changed and was not the same as before. In the past 8 years, everyone had hidden their own thoughts in their hearts. Many things could not be changed, and they could only accept it, just like her and Yi Muyun, like Gumei and Zhou Chengwang, and like Gu Zhe had Mu Mu in his heart. She shook her head and said softly, "Take good care of him. Don't you hate him?" Gu Zhe suddenly said in a very calm voice, "If he really did it." "No." Cher raised her eyes and smiled at Gu Zhe, but her smile was paler than crying. Gu Zhe walked up to her, reached out for the first time, and gently stroked her little head. He said, gently, "There will always be a result. Cher, tell your heart. Who do you like? Is it still Mr. Yi?" There was the sound of water in her eyes, but she couldn't say anything. Gu Zhe smiled again. "Wait for me in the parking lot. I'll take you back to the hotel after I settle things here." Cher didn't refuse, but she turned back after taking 2 steps. She looked up at Gu Zhe and asked hesitantly, "Will he be all right?" Gu Zhe stroked his handsome chin and smiled. I won't die, but if you continue to anger him, who knows?" Cher pursed her lips and glared at Gu Zhe with a strange expression before running away. Gu Zhe smiled. In fact, Cher hadn't changed at all. However, she didn't change because of Mr. Yi. Deep down, she was already a mature woman, but subconsciously, she retained a part of her innocence. That was the memory of her and Mr. Yi. Even the current Lan Yu should be irreplaceable. Gu Zhe watched her leave, then turned around and walked into the ward. As soon as he entered, he sighed in his heart. They were really a good match. Fortunately, he let Cher leave first. Otherwise, she might faint if she saw Mr. Yi like this. At this time, Yi Muyun's wound, which had just been operated on a few days ago, was completely torn. His hospital gown was full of blood, and the ward was in a mess. Everything was broken. The back of his hand was also full of blood, which was thrown on the ground. Gu Zhe frowned. "Mr. Yi, you're courting death." Chapter 22:36. Yi Muyun stared at Gu Zhe in the bloody light, which was quite scary. Gu Zhe shrugged. "What I said is the truth. Or is it that Mr. Yi feels that there is no hope and wants to give Cher to someone else? Oh, and I remember that Mr. Tang Yu has already transferred 20% of his shares to you, right? Well, if he died of anger, everything would belong to someone else." Yi Muyun was still staring at Gu Zhe. Gu Zhe said casually, "It will be the same if I change the owner. Think about it. Cher is not very good at managing the company. Maybe I can do whatever I want in the company in the future and then become the actual owner of Boyi." Gu Zhe smiled. "Of course, all this is based on the foundation that you will die of anger, Mr. Yi." Yi Muyun almost spat out a mouthful of blood. Listen, was this what Gu Zhe said? This was what Vice President Gu, whom he had promoted personally, said. Just these few words were enough to make him vomit blood. Why would he need Cher? Seeing that it was about time, Gu Zhe immediately walked out quickly. He ran in the nurse outside and quickly gave a few orders in a low voice. Just now, he seemed to be very relaxed and joking, but in fact he was not relaxed. Mr. Ye's injury seemed to be very serious. If he was not treated, he was afraid that something big would happen. Guze had a strong psychological quality. After quickly giving orders to the little nurse, he called the director and asked the best surgeon to come over. When he walked into the ward again, Yi Muyun was almost unable to hold on. He held him and couldn't help scolding, "You are clearly sick, but you are still so angry with her. If you had been a little softer, she wouldn't have left like that." This was what Guze was thinking, and only at this time did he dare to say it to him. Because Yi Muyun was proud, he usually didn't listen to it, or even if he did, he would get angry. In his heart, Tang Sher was his possession from childhood to adulthood. It was only during the 8 years that they were separated that she was his, both physically and mentally. Now that the incident with Lan Yu had happened, although their relationship was not clear yet, it was enough to make Mr. Yi feel jealous. Yi Muyun's face was pale, and he did not speak for a long time. After a long time, he gritted his teeth and said, "Let's go to the operating room." Guze was relieved. He immediately helped him to the bed and pushed him to the operating room. When had their CEO Yi ever been in such a sorry state before? Because the wound was quite serious, the surgery lasted for more than an hour. Fortunately, it did not hurt the inside. After Yi Muyun was pushed out, Guze was relieved. He also thought of Shui Er in the parking lot. However, when he was about to go downstairs, he saw Cher in the corridor outside the operating theater. She leaned against the wall, lost in thought. Guze frowned and walked over. His voice was very soft. "Why are you here?" Cher looked at him and pursed her lips. "I heard it from a nurse, so I didn't leave." She paused before asking, "How is he? You're not going to see it for yourself?" Guze looked up at her as he took out a cigarette and took a puff. Cher didn't say anything. Her expression was a little deep. Guze held a cigarette between his slender fingers and looked at her. "I was so angry with you just now that the wound was torn by 5 centimeters. As he spoke, he gestured and coughed softly. "It's even bigger than the incision in the operating theater." Chapter 22:37. Cher pursed her lips tightly. "Are you still not going to see him?" Guze's voice was soft. "The doctor said that he's in a critical condition tonight. He'll be fine if he doesn't have a fever tonight." Seeing that she was still as unmoving as a mountain, Guze quietly took out his killer's GN. However, you can't be blamed for Boss Ye's illness. She fell ill during the reality show a few days ago. She didn't recover at first, but then she ran back again. She didn't even rest, and her stomach perforated. This touched the deepest part of Cher's heart. She knew better than anyone why Yi Miyun had a fever, and then they slept together for a night. She pursed her lips and said softly after a long time, "I'll go see him." Guze laughed. "That's right. Even if we can't be husband and wife, we can still be friends, right?" Cher glared at him. Guze touched his nose again. "We're still brother and sister, aren't we?" When he said this, he was thinking that they had slept together so many times. How could they still be brother and sister? With that said, he looked at Cher. Cher followed him upstairs to the VIP ward. The ward had been cleaned up, and there was no sign of it being smashed. Yi Muyun lay there quietly, his face pale. Cher stood by the bed and looked at him. Guze said softly, "I know that he's the only one you like, isn't he? If not, why would she be willing to sleep with Mr. Yi?" Cher did not say anything. She just stood there and looked at Yi Muyun quietly. She felt a little pain in her heart and said softly, "If I had known, I wouldn't have come back." She sometimes felt that he was cruel. Back then, he had tacitly agreed to her leaving. It wasn't that she didn't hate him, but she missed him even more. When she came back, she thought that she might bump into him. She thought that they were fine and wouldn't have anything to do with each other anymore. But she was still entangled with him. Too many assumptions made him lie here today. "Is it because of my arrogance that you ended up like this?" She asked in a low voice as she slowly sat down on the edge of the bed. She seemed to be talking to Guze, but it was more like she was muttering to herself. "After so many years, it turns out that you can't let it go even more than I can." She could have let go of everything and returned to New York, but now that he was like this, she couldn't let go. How could she not know what he was thinking? He tormented himself and caused himself to be covered in injuries. That was his unspeakable pride. Yi Muyun would never open his mouth to beg a woman. He could only express it by hurting himself. When did he start acting like this? She was sad, but she couldn't stay for him. Guze, do you think I'm cruel? She asked softly. She did not cry because he was asleep. Ever since they were young, he had always been unshakable, standing in front of her like a god. She had never seen him fall. Was this another way for him to show his weakness? Guze said in a low voice, "No, never. If he was cruel, he wouldn't have been entangled for so long." Her dilemma and uncertainty were probably because of the changes in the past 8 years. If she had known that it would be like this after 8 years, she definitely wouldn't have been willing to do that. Or rather, the changes in the middle were things she couldn't change. Guze sighed. "Can't you stay? You know he needs you." Cher was stunned. After a long time, she slowly shook her head. That's just more cruel to him. She raised her head and smiled, but her eyes were filled with tears. Guze, I'll leave tomorrow. Chapter 22:38. Guze looked at her with a solemn expression on his face. After a while, his gaze landed on Yi Muyun, and he said softly, "Are you going to give up on him?" Cher pursed her lips, and her body trembled uncontrollably. After a long while, she said in a low voice, "Yes." Guze pursed his thin lips and said calmly, "Go back to America before he finds out. Perhaps this is for the best for both of us." Cher nodded her head solemnly. She looked at Yi Muyun again. He was lying there quietly, but he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. As she looked at him, her eyes became a little moist, and she couldn't help tearing up. She said to Guze in a low voice, "Can I kiss him?" Guze suddenly felt extremely upset. What had happened to her in the past for her to love so carefully and hide all her emotions? For her to not dare to be with Mr. Yi? Guze pursed his lips and closed his eyes slightly. His voice was hoarse as he said, "Of course." Then, Cher bent down and kissed Yi Muyun's lips gently. His lips were a little dry and a little bitter, but her tears kept falling uncontrollably and landed on his lips. His lips moved slightly, like a person who had been dry for a long time touching the first drop of water. However, it wasn't water. It was salty. Yi Muyun's eyelids moved, and he opened them immediately to look at her. Cher's eyes widened, and she looked at him in disbelief. She wanted to escape, but his hand quickly grabbed her. Although it was weak, it was enough to catch her. His voice was hoarse and broken. "Are you trying to escape again? Are you trying to escape to his side?" She struggled with all her might, but she didn't dare to use too much force for fear of hurting him. Guze watched from the side and let out a long sigh. He quietly retreated and left the room for the two of them. The ward was silent. Cher lowered her eyes. "Let go." One of her tears fell on the back of his hand, startling her and burning his heart. "Why are you crying?" He looked at her, his voice weak. It had taken all his strength to hold her, but he did not allow himself to fall, because if he did, she would probably leave. Cher shook her head. "I didn't cry. Little liar." He closed his eyes tiredly. "You're still so stupid. You can't even lie." When he opened his eyes again, his gaze was captivating. "Tang Cher, if you don't love me anymore, I'll let you go. But you clearly can't forget me, so why should I let you go?" Even in his heart, he was extremely jealous. Cher bit her lips and looked at him helplessly. His fingers slowly loosened, and in an instant, she was like a frightened bunny, shrinking back. He lay there weakly and said slowly, "How you walk out, I want to see how you walk back." Cher's body leaned against the doorknob, her face full of tears. "Why are you so persistent?" He closed his eyes and stayed silent for a long time. "Then tell me, what did we do when we were together for the past few days?" Cher couldn't say it. It would be too cruel to him or her. She didn't say anything. Yi Muyun smiled and said in a self-deprecating manner, "Go." Her body relaxed, but she didn't leave immediately. Yi Muyun looked at her. "Why? You can't bear to leave?" Chapter 22:39. Shui bit her lip. No. She twisted her slender fingers, which was her habit of lying. She hadn't improved at all these years. He sneered again. Let's go. Aren't you afraid that I'll pester you? Cher looked at him, suddenly feeling a little desolate. This was a man she loved the most in her life. She loved him in the past, and she still loved him now, but she didn't choose to be with him. She didn't know if it was right or wrong. She didn't know if it was fair to him or herself. Perhaps she had never thought of turning back. She just wanted to know if he was doing well. She took a deep breath and walked towards him slowly, all the way to the bed. She kissed his lips. What is this? Yi Muyun's gaze was stern. Is this your last gift? Her lips trembled. No. She closed her eyes and called out, Brother. He was stunned. Then she walked away from his palm. The door to the ward opened and closed, but he couldn't see her anymore. Yi Muyun looked at her quietly for a long time. Guze walked in and let out a long sigh. Mr. Yi really shouldn't be hurting himself now. Yi Muyun closed his eyes slightly and said tiredly, Arrange it now. Don't let her leave the country. Guze was stunned. Yi Muyun slowly opened his eyes. Why else do you think Qin Mu can't leave? Guze despised his Mr. Yi deeply. He actually learned how to court women from Zhou Chengwang. However, when Yi Muyun mentioned Qin Mu just now, his heart still hurt. He smiled lightly. Okay, I'll do it. But he guessed that Lan Yu would definitely come to City B. This was what Mr. Yi wanted. Why torture yourself? Just as Yi Muyun had planned, Cher was unable to leave. Her visa was rejected, and she was still staying in the GM hotel. She knew very well why she couldn't leave. It was all Yi Muyun's plan. She went to see Guze, but Guze did not deny it. He said that it was Mr. Ye's arrangement. On the third day of her stay at the GM hotel, the incident of her plagiarizing Lan Yu had reached a certain point. Cher could hardly move a single step in the hotel. Sometimes, she would see news about Yi Muyun on the news. However, on the third day, she saw him leave the hospital and appear at a summit. So much blood, such a big wound, and he was discharged just like that? Through the screen, she could see the exhaustion beneath his bright exterior. He was not made of iron after all. Cher just watched. She didn't know why, but she felt extremely upset. She wanted to turn off the television, but the next news shocked her. At the GM hotel, there was a live broadcast of a press conference. It was quite a big scene. The mainstream media in City B were all present. More importantly, the main lead, Cher knew him. That person was Lan Yu. Lan Yu, who rarely appeared in the media, was tall and skinny. He was wearing a simple white shirt and a set of black casual clothes, which made him look handsome. His facial features were deep and gentle. He was probably mixed with some foreign blood. At this moment, he was very calm as he faced the camera. Cher couldn't hear what he was saying. She only knew that it was related to her. She was stunned. Lan Yu had said that he would never step foot in City B again. Why did he come back? She bit her lip, her heart heaving up and down. Then, she ran out of the suite. She pressed the elevator button hard. Her expression was anxious. Chapter 2240. Even if Yi Muyun had guessed it, she didn't want him to hear it. That would be too cruel to him. The elevator finally opened. She ran in, looking a little frantic. The elevator went down floor by floor until it reached the first floor. Cher ran out, still wearing indoor slippers. She grabbed a hotel staff and asked anxiously, "Which floor is Lan Yu's press conference on?" The hotel staff didn't recognize her at first and was shocked. When she recognized her, she said respectfully, "I'll bring Miss Tang there." Cher followed her to the reception room on the first floor. The staff opened the door for her. When the door slowly opened, she saw Lan Yu. Lan Yu saw her too. Cher stood there, her body almost unable to move. She just stood there and looked at him. Lan Yu's gaze landed on her. After a long time, he said softly, "My wife, Tang Cher, is also in." The crowd was in an uproar. Following that, the reporters followed Lan Yu's gaze and found Cher. They began snapping pictures of her, capturing her shock and astonishment clearly. Her lips moved, but in the end, she couldn't say anything. Lan Yu continued, "Rainy Night is a painting that my wife made as a tribute to me. She said that she wanted to paint it in the same series as A Cloudy Day. I don't think this is plagiarism. With that, he stretched out his hand to Cher. Come here. Cher didn't move. She just stared at him, unable to move. Lan Yu still walked over to her slowly. He had a slight smile on his face. He walked over to her and hugged her. This scene was captured on camera. She was brought to the stage in a daze. She didn't hear what Lan Yu said. Her gaze was fixed in the direction of the door, because Yi Mu-yun was standing there. His face was still pale, without a trace of expression. His eyes stared deeply at her, watching her in Lan Yu's embrace. She saw a trace of disillusionment in his eyes. Suddenly, Cher felt like crying. Why did he come? He had clearly guessed it. She didn't react at all. She didn't know that Lan Yu had kissed her, even though it was on her forehead. Then a little radish head appeared by her feet. It was Ishu, and she called out Mommy in a cute manner. Cher wanted to push Lan Yu's fingers away. She clenched her fists and pursed her lips tightly. She could no longer push Lan Yu away in front of Lan Ishu. Lan Yu reached out and picked up the beautiful boy. He faced the camera and said very generously, "This is my son with Lan Ishu." Cher's heart trembled. When she looked up again, there was no one there. Yi Mu-yun was no longer there. That place was empty, just like her heart at this moment. Xiao Ishu was placed in her arms. The warm little person hugged her neck and acted very coquettishly. Mommy. Shue. Kissed him on the cheek and hugged him tightly. No one would doubt that there were not 3 families of 3, because when put together, it was very pleasing to the eye. It looked like a family. A family. Yi Mu-yun sat in the limousine. His thumb was on his thin lips, and his face was as dark as water. The driver started the car and asked softly, "Mr. Yi, where do you want to go?" Yi Mu-yun closed his eyes. "Back to Peiyuan." The driver was a little surprised because Mr. Yi rarely went there. If he went, he would go to see Mr. and Mrs. Tang. Mr. and Mrs. Tang were not in the country. The driver hesitated for a moment. "Are you going to get something?" This time, Yi Mu-yun didn't answer. Get something? Could he get it back this time? Chapter 22:41. The black limousine drove towards Pei Garden. When the car stopped, Yi Mu-yun said indifferently, "You can leave first. I want to be alone for a while." The driver nodded and quickly got out of the car. Yi Mu-yun sat for a while longer before opening the door and getting out. It was already late autumn, and the trees in Pei Garden were slightly withered and yellow, unlike before. He put on his jacket and walked along the path to the main house. He remembered that when he was young, there were many fireflies here, especially in the summer. As for that chubby little yellow bun, she was always wearing a pretty little white dress. She pouted and said to him, "Big brother, you just need to catch 2 of them." She was very curious about shiny things, but if he really caught it for her, she would be scared to death and ask him to show it to her. She would always cover her chubby little finger and sneak a peek at it. She was extremely timid, and she was especially good for nothing. Yi Mu-yun stood there, his gaze warm. He still remembered that between her round little fingers, her eyes were also round, black and white, so cute. Cute. She had been cute since she was young, and it had always belonged to him. Yi Mu-yun was so conceited that he never thought that one day another man would appear by her side, even during the years they had been apart. But not only did they have a relationship, but they also got married and had a 5-year-old child. That child was 5 or 6 years old. Had she been with Lan Yu for more than a year after she left him? Yi Mu-yun chuckled softly, and it was an extremely bitter smile. He reached out to cover his eyes, not letting the sun shine on his pale face at this moment. His heart was full of sorrow. He couldn't even squeeze out a bitter smile. He slowly walked into the main house, waved the servants away, and walked upstairs step by step. The servants were a little worried, so they called Guze. Guze hesitated for a moment and asked them to leave first. At this time, he thought that Yi Mu-yun needed to calm down. But this calmness lasted for 2 days and 2 nights. Yi Mu-yun switched off his phone and unplugged all communication devices. He locked himself in Pei Garden. Other than eating something when he was hungry, he didn't even take a shower. He just lay there, in the bedroom she had slept in. That place was still the same as when she left. He had people come in every day to tidy it up and place a fresh rose on it. When he missed her too much, he would come and sleep for one night, and no one would know the secret. But now, as he lay there, he couldn't smell her usual milky scent. Instead, it was replaced by the faint scent of softener. Yimeyun began to suffer from insomnia, severe insomnia. After 2 days and 2 nights, he lost a lot of weight. At the same time, people all over the world were looking for the CEO of Boyi, Guze, but he had not appeared. GM Hotel. Cher flipped through the picture book and accompanied Lan Yishu. The 5-year-old Xiao Yishu was very talented in drawing. She must have inherited Lan Yu's genes. She looked sideways, and she looked a little like Lan Yu. If the child she was pregnant with was still around, he would be 2 years older than Yishu, and he would be as obedient and well-behaved as him. As she thought about it, Cher's little face became a little dazed, and there was some sadness in her eyes. Xiao Yishu reached out and pinched her face. The child's fingers were soft. And what are you thinking about? Chapter 2242. Xiao Yishu's round face was filled with disappointment. "Mommy, you can't do this," Cher said in a low voice. In her heart, however, she was thinking that she couldn't be like her mommy back then. So stupid, so lazy, and incapable of doing anything. Although Yishu wasn't her child, he was no different from her own. She remembered that when she was lying in the hospital half dead and as thin as a bag of bones, it was Lan Yu who pushed Xiao Yishu into her arms. When she smelled the milky scent on Xiao Yishu, she felt that her dried-up soul was healed. Xiao Yishu had saved her. Lan Yu told her that if she married him, Yishu would be her son. At that time, she agreed without a second thought, because at that time, she desperately wanted to live and wanted to have Yishu. For the past 5 years, rather than saying that Yishu relied on her, it would be more accurate to say that she relied on Yishu. The milky scent on him was very similar to the scent of her childhood. She smelled it greedily. Just by smelling it, it was like returning to that person's side. Lan Yu didn't know that in the middle of the night, she would hug Yishu and cry until Yishu could speak. She raised Yishu, but she had never asked Lan Yu who Yishu's mother was. After a long time, she felt that she was Xiao Yishu's mother. She couldn't bear to part with Yishu. The little guy was probably a little sad. He turned around and looked at her with his little butt. Cher was both annoyed and amused. She didn't know if it was because she had taught him that Yishu was very similar to her when she was young. He didn't like to study and liked to draw with a brush. At this time, looking at his little face, she smiled and picked him up from behind. She kissed him. "Didn't we agree? But I don't like going to school with a bunch of blue-eyed people." Xiao Yishu hugged her little neck and acted like a spoiled child. Cher frowned. Just then, Lan Yu came out of the bathroom, wearing only a bathrobe. He picked up his son and kissed him. "You like little girls with black hair and black eyes, don't you?" Xiao Yishu's adorable face instantly turned red, and she didn't say a word. Cher was stunned. Then, she looked at Lan Yu and said, "It can't be. He's so young. How would he know?" Lan Yu smiled as he kissed his son, seemingly very indifferent as he said, "He and I have the same hobbies, black hair and black eyes." As he spoke, his large palm reached out and stroked her long hair. Cher suddenly felt a little uncomfortable. Since when did he like this? Although they would occasionally be intimate outside, he had said that he had someone else in his heart, so they would only be husband and wife in name. He would not ask her to fulfill the duties of a husband and wife. It had been like this for the past 5 years. The two of them were more like brother and sister than husband and wife. Cher got up and scratched her hair. "I'm going to take a shower first." Coax Yishu to sleep. Lan Yu watched her leave. In his arms, Xiao Yishu said softly, "Daddy, the little girl you like is Mommy?" Lan Yu rubbed his little head and smiled faintly. "Yeah, Daddy likes Mommy a lot." Xiao Yishu hugged his neck. "Then I like people like Mommy too." Lan Yu's eyes darkened. He turned his head and looked in the direction of the bathroom. Then, he carried his son and walked toward the master bedroom. "All right, sleep first. Then you'll grow up. Like a little mushroom." Xiao Yishu asked seriously as he lay down. Lan Yu's hand, that was covering him with a blanket, paused. He hesitated for a moment before asking, "Who taught you that?" "Mommy," Xiao Ishu said innocently. Lan Yu's expression was a little strange as he thought to himself. She really knew how to use metaphors. Chapter 2243. No matter what, the little mushroom was coaxed to sleep. By the time Cher came out of the bathroom, the little guy was already eating his fingers, his chubby little body turned sideways, and his little face was soft. Cher sighed again. She had raised this child to be like her own flesh and blood. Every move he made was like her when she was young. Asleep, she wiped her hair with a towel and walked over softly. She naturally leaned over and kissed the little guy who smelled like milk. Lan Yu sat by the bed and smiled faintly. I still can't get rid of the habit of eating my fingers. His gaze unexpectedly fell on her face and then moved down to the spring scenery in front of her. Lan Yu's gaze became a little deep and distant. He didn't look at her for long and then got up. "Let's go to the bathroom. I'll help you dry your hair." Cher looked up. "Go to sleep first. I'll do it myself later." Lan Yu was already leaning against the door of the bathroom. He looked at her deeply. "Is there anything different?" "What?" Cher's voice was light. Lan Yu's gaze deepened. He looked at her unfathomably and said softly, "And is there any difference between the city and New York?" She held her breath and looked at him for a long time. Finally, she lowered her little head and moved her lips slightly. "No." He smiled and walked over slowly. He reached out and stroked her long hair. "That's good." He walked past her and entered the bathroom. Cher was still standing there in a daze for a while before she followed him in. Lan Yu was already waiting for her with the hairdryer. She walked over and stood in front of him consciously. She was only 162, while Lan Yu was 182. In the mirror, she looked especially small. Lan Yu closed the door and held her hair with one hand and began to dry it for her. Under the rumbling sound of the hairdryer, no one made a sound. It seemed that this kind of sound just happened to be able to eliminate the subtle atmosphere between them. As for what was wrong, Cher couldn't put her finger on it. Lan Yu should know about Yi Mu-yun, but he didn't ask. He just told him, just like before. However, was it really the same? She peeped at him in the mirror, but it was foggy and she could not see very clearly. "What's wrong? Is there something on your mind?" Lan Yu smiled gently and looked at her in the mirror. Similarly, he could not see her clearly. Cher shook her head. "No, don't move." He pressed one hand on her shoulder. When their skin touched, Cher's body stiffened. He obviously felt it too, but he just smiled. With great difficulty, he helped her dry her hair and patted her. "Done." "Oh." She pursed her lips, looked up at him, and did not say anything else. Lan Yu naturally put his arm around her shoulder and took her to the master bedroom. His voice was calm and gentle. "Go to sleep. We'll take Ishu to the amusement park tomorrow." He paused for a moment. He made a fuss, saying that he hasn't seen you for a long time. Cher's expression was a little stiff. She looked up at Lan Yu and finally said, "Okay." At this time, they had already walked to the bed together. Lan Yu pressed her shoulder. "Good night, kiss." With that, he leaned forward and kissed her forehead. Cher instinctively turned her face away. Lan Yu's lips touched her hair, but he did not force it. He just slightly looked at her. "I'm going to the guest room." With that, he walked out. Cher looked at him from behind, pursed her lips, and did not say anything. Chapter 2244. After the door was closed, she slowly lay down beside Xiao Ishu. She reached out and held the little boy in her arms, feeling his softness. Xiao Ishu smelled like milk. She rested her chin on his little head. She could understand why Yi Mu-yun always hugged and smelled her when she was young. Shui-er pursed her lips even tighter at this thought. A few days had passed. How was he? She called Guze once, but Guze said that he was not at work and did not know where he was. She did not know how she had been these days. She could not let go of him, but she did not dare to care about him. What reason did she have to care about him now? And he must hate her to the core. She closed her eyes in frustration. But when she closed her eyes, her mind was filled with Yi Mu-yun's ashen face. She did not sleep well that night. Early the next morning, she was woken up by Xiao Ishu's kiss. "Mommy," "Mommy, mommy, mommy." The little boy lay on his stomach, his chubby little hands wrapped around Schwerer's neck. Cher couldn't do anything about him. She opened her eyes, hugged him, and kissed him hard. "Ishu, let mommy sleep a little longer. Just for a while." Xiao Ishu lay in her arms obediently. But it only lasted for a while before he started to cling to her again. And Cher had an exclusive way to deal with Ishu's clinging, which was to pretend to be dead. She closed her eyes and pretended not to be awake. Xiao Ishu looked at her mother. It was useless to pinch her nose. After thinking for a while, she finally got out of bed. He left. Cher breathed a sigh of relief and prepared to take a nap. But only 5 minutes later, Xiao Ishu's footsteps sounded again. She let the little boy kiss her face. "Ishu, let mommy sleep a little longer. It's 9 o'clock. Are you sure you still want to sleep?" A deep male voice rang in her ears. Cher suddenly opened her eyes and stared at Lan Yu in a daze. It took her quite a while to come back to herself and slowly sat up. "It's you." Lan Yu was already neatly dressed in a white shirt and a pair of black trousers. Standing like this, his legs were 8 meters long. He smiled faintly. "The little guy is already eating breakfast. He's waiting for you." Cher nodded and scratched her messy hair, feeling a little uncomfortable. "Okay." He smiled and quickly walked out. Cher got out of bed and walked into the bathroom to brush her teeth. While brushing her teeth, she stared blankly at herself in the mirror. In fact, she had been sleeping in separate rooms with Lan Yu ever since they got married. She didn't feel that there was anything wrong with it. She had never felt uncomfortable living with him, nor had there been too much pressure. Although they were husband and wife, they were more like master and disciple. He was the one who guided her in painting, and she often called him Teacher Lan. After living together for a long time, she felt that life was probably like this. However, there was still someone else in his heart. But when she came back, she still hurt him. If she didn't come back, would he give up in 2 years and marry Song Karen? Cher thought about it in a daze. After brushing her teeth and washing her face, she tidied up a little and went to the living room. Breakfast was prepared by Lan Yu in the kitchen. He made Ishu's favorite honey bread. At this moment, the little boy was enjoying it. Shui sat down beside her, and the little fellow gave her a peck on the lips before burying her head in her work again. Chapter 2245. Lan Yu sat opposite her and smiled. "Are you blaming me for making him fat these days?" Cher snorted softly, indicating that she meant it. Lan Yu's smile deepened. "Then I'll leave the rest to you." "No, you take care of it." She expressed her disgust for the kitchen. Lan Yu didn't say anything more, but just rubbed the little guy's head. "Son, eat less. Your mommy doesn't like you anymore." "I didn't say that." Cher opened her eyes wide. Xiao Ishu looked at Cher and called out, "Mommy." Her voice was soft and sweet. Cher said helplessly, "You'll be cuter if you're fatter." So Xiao Ishu ate 2 more honey bread than usual. Lan Yu looked at her disapprovingly. "This won't do." Cher simply stared at him. Lan Yu shrugged, picked up his empty cup, and poured himself another cup of coffee. He was tall and very good-looking, completely different from the poor painter in her impression. He also had a faint aristocratic aura. Cher hadn't asked his family, but she could feel that he came from a good family. From the big apartment in New York that he arranged for her to the car that he drove, it wasn't something that a painter could afford. She had been a little absent-minded, and Lan Yu would inadvertently look at her, but she didn't notice it at all. She also didn't notice that the way that the man looked at her had quietly changed in the past few years. After breakfast, Lan Yu held Xiao Ishu while Cher carried her backpack. The 3 of them went downstairs, got into the car, and went to the zoo. Pay Garden. Yi Muyun sat in the hall on the first floor. The autumn sun shone brightly into the hall, but it couldn't shine into his heart. Compared to before, he was a little thinner, and there was a sense of coldness all over him. In front of him stood a young man in casual clothes. He had a sun hat on his head and a camera on his body. He looked like a photographer. "Mr. Yi, this was taken today." Miss Tang didn't leave the hotel for the past 2 days. The young man handed a stack of photos to Yi Muyun. Yi Muyun sat on the sofa. His pure white bathrobe made him look extremely handsome, but could be seen that his body was even thinner around his loosened collar. His dark eyes were unfathomable as he said lightly, "You may leave first." The young man did not dare to stay any longer and immediately retreated. After that person left, the surroundings became quiet again. Yimuyun lowered his gaze and quietly looked at the stack of photos on the table. Finally, he picked them up and looked at them one by one. Every picture was of a family of 3 together. The child was almost always carried by Lan Yu or sat on his shoulder, while Cher was always by his side. Occasionally, when there were many people around, her hand would be held by the man. Yimuyun looked at them one by one. She looked at them very carefully, but the pain in her eyes grew heavier. He desperately wanted to find some information, but there was none. Lan Yu and Tang Cher were like the most peaceful couple in the world. They did not need to do much to show that they were in harmony. Suddenly, he was swept to the ground. If they were in harmony, then what about him? Yimuyun? What about the days they spent together in Yunnan? When they made love, her pandering, what did it matter? The photos floated down like snowflakes, blocking his expressionless face. Chapter 2246. When Guze came over, he saw such a scene. His expression froze, and he sighed in his heart. "How's the investigation going?" Yimuyun raised his eyes. There was an indisputable scarlet in his eyes. Guze sat opposite him and said slowly, "They got married 5.5 years ago in New York." Yimuyun's face trembled and his fingers clenched into fists. What about the child? He didn't know why he asked. The child was obviously only 5 years old, but his heart was yearning for the most impossible possibility. Guze shook his head gently. According to Lan Ishu's birth certificate, she's only 5 years old. Sure enough, he should have thought of it long ago. Yimuyun closed his eyes. Why did he still have that kind of expectation in his heart? It was ridiculous and pitiful. Yimuyun covered his eyes with his fingers and said softly, "Guze, let me be alone for a while." At this moment, he couldn't move, as if all the strength in his body had been sucked away. Guze was worried, but he couldn't disobey, so he nodded. "I'll be in the car outside." He knew Mr. Ye's feelings for Cher, from 10 years old to 30 years old. How could he let go of a relationship that had lasted for 20 years? After 8 years, Mr. Ye's love had become twisted and stubborn. Guze didn't know what to say. He didn't have the right to say anything. His sister, Gume, was also involved in what happened 8 years ago. He left quietly, leaving the space for Yimuyun. Yimuyun leaned against the sofa and placed his fingers on his eyes. After a long time, there was liquid slowly flowing from the gap between his slender fingers. He didn't care about it and just sat there quietly. At that moment, he heard the sound of his heart tearing. It was like a piece of cloth being torn open. "It hurts, it hurts." His handsome face contorted in pain. He squatted down and frantically searched the ground. Finally, he found a photo of her alone. She was wearing a thick sweater, carrying a small bag, and looking up at the sun. She was smiling faintly, revealing her canine teeth. It was how he remembered her. It was him, the little Cher whom he had loved for so many years, his little heart. It was his heart his entire life. He knelt on the ground and stared at her. Suddenly, he squeezed the photo into his own mouth and squeezed it with all his might. He cried bitterly. This was the darkest day of his life. This was the most embarrassing moment of his life. However, she was not here. She belonged to someone else. Guze was sitting in the car outside when he suddenly heard a heart-wrenching sound that almost tore at his heart. The cigarette at the tip of his finger trembled. He wanted to rush into it, but he resisted the urge. This was a hurdle that only Mr. Yi could overcome by himself. No one else could help him. For the first time, he knew what a man was like when he was in despair. Rather than saying that Yimuyun was a career-ambitious person, it would be more accurate to say that everything he had done since he was 10 years old was because of a girl named Tang Cher. Now, all his faith had collapsed. Where should he go? Guze's face was blank. He thought of Qin Mu. Perhaps Qin Mu's love for Zhou Chengwang, Gume's love for Zhou Chengwang, or Zhou Chengwang's love for Cher were not even 1/10 as persistent as Yimuyun's love for Cher. Excessive stubbornness would only hurt oneself. Chapter 2247. Guzay couldn't tell how he had changed. He just felt that he was different. Check the Lan family situation. Yimouyin looked at Guzay. Didn't you say that Lan Yu is the eldest son of the Lan family? I think if something happens to the Grand Hyatt, he probably won't sit back and do nothing. Guzay narrowed his eyes. The Grand Hyatt was the largest hotel chain in the country. There were more than 200 five-star hotels all over the country, and Lan Yu was the only heir. However, he had been hiding in New York all these years for unknown reasons. Guzay hesitated for a moment and finally nodded. Got it. He roughly understood what Mr. Yi meant. But would Cher agree to Mr. Yi doing this? The situation in Boyi was a bit complicated. Mr. Tang, you had 40% of the shares. 20% had been transferred to Cher, and the other 20% had been transferred to Mr. Yi a few years ago. At that time, everyone thought that President Tang meant for Mr. Yi to wait. But looking at the situation today, this 20% was compensation. 5 years ago, Cher and Lan Yu had gotten married. Guzay's heart turned cold when he thought about it. This battle wasn't between Lan Yu and Mr. Yi, but between Mr. Yi and Cher. When the time came, it would probably involve forcing the Lan family to abdicate. It was obvious that Mr. Yi wanted to do this. Guzay had a premonition. Boyi was going to change, and he hadn't thought about picking a side. No matter what the result was, he thought that he would still stand by Mr. Ye's side. He didn't think about winning or losing anything, because that was how he had been all these years. In just a few short minutes, Guzay's heart had already gone through 1,000 thoughts. When he stepped out of Pei Garden, he raised his head to look at the blazing sun above his head and smiled faintly. In the villa, Yimouyin picked up the photos one by one, forming a thick stack. He found a pair of scissors and cut the photos of her and Lan Yu one by one. Her photo remained, while Lan Yu's. He put in the ashtray and lit it with a lighter. In the light of the fire, his face seemed especially unfathomable. The next day, Yimouyin went to Boyi. Over the next few days, he received several important shareholders. Each meeting lasted more than 4 hours. This was definitely not normal. Boyi's employees began to feel uneasy. These business elites were all thousand-year-old foxes. Their sense of smell was as sensitive as animals before a catastrophe. The first to feel that something was wrong was Xiaoran. As a senior member of the company, she was no longer a secretary, but managed the HR department. However, she knew the movements of the company like the back of her hand. She had watched Yimouyin grow up, and she had also heard about the explosive news these days. She knew that if Yimouyin wanted to do something, even the gods couldn't stop him. She wasn't sure if Tang Yu had thought that this day would come, or if he had been too confident in Yimouyin. But when it came to Cher, Yimouyin would throw away all his beliefs. Mr. Tang couldn't be unaware of this, but why did he still do it? Xiaoran still called Tang Yu, who was far away abroad. After the call, she slowly put down her phone, looking a little confused. She never thought that Tang Yu would think this way, since he had predicted it. Why did he do it? Chapter 2248. Cher stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of the hotel, looking down at the night view of B City. Lan Yu stood behind her and said gently, "It seems that you haven't painted for a long time. You once said that creating can make you calm down." Cher was still standing. She looked at the neon lights outside and said softly, "Lan Yu, after I painted that rainy night, I thought I'd let go of it." She turned around slowly and looked at him. "So I didn't." His brows furrowed. His voice was flat, but there was a hint of hoarseness that was hard to detect. "And do you want to go back to him?" Snow's breath caught her throat. She stared at him, unmoving. Lan Yu smiled gently and reached out to stroke her hair. She didn't move at all. After a long time, she said carefully, "I want to go back to New York." Lan Yu's expression became gentler, and he smiled. "We'll go back soon." He walked forward and looked at the night view of B City with her. After a while, he suddenly turned his head and said, "Go home with me tomorrow." "Go home?" Cher was a little stunned. Lan Yu laughed lightly. "Is it strange? I didn't jump out of a rock." Cher still looked at him in confusion. She didn't understand why he hadn't gone home after so many years. Lan Yu looked at her and smiled lightly. He reached out and touched her little head. "Okay, go to bed early." Cher turned her little face and looked at him. Okay, you go to bed early too. However, Lan Yu didn't leave immediately. His dark eyes were fixed on her, and under the chandelier, they seemed to be shining. For some reason, Cher's heart skipped a beat, and she looked at him almost helplessly. Lan Yu went forward and stood very close to her. He could trap her in his arms if he stretched out his hand. He lowered his head, and his thin lips were very close to her ear. He almost whispered, "Have you never thought about being with me for real?" Cher looked up and stared at him for a long time without saying a word. Lan Yu looked at her and smiled. "Are you scared?" he said lightly. "I'm joking." "A little," she said honestly. "I thought you only needed a little nanny to take care of the child." There was a trace of smile in Lan Yu's eyes. "I seem to be taking care of you too." She took care of the child? She could only play with the child. He took care of the other household matters. Cher blushed. She had to admit that she had taken advantage of Lan Yu by marrying him. He provided her with food and lodging, and even gave her a son to play with. But she really loved Ishu. She also knew that Lan Yu would not give Ishu to her if she asked for a divorce. Ishu was his son, not hers. Between Ishu and Yi Muyun, she instinctively chose Ishu. After a long time, she couldn't help but think that perhaps this was motherly instinct. Or perhaps she could feel that Ishu had a blood connection that she couldn't bear to part with. Lan Yu didn't say anything else and just told her to go to bed early. Cher grunted in acknowledgement. "I'd like to draw a sketch later." He looked at her, and his gaze was very profound under the lights. After a long time, he smiled and left. Cher stood for a long time, walked to the sofa, and picked up the sketchbook. She hadn't done a sketch for a long time. It seemed to be 8 years. She vaguely remembered, but she just didn't want to pick it up. Chapter 2249. She was drawing Yi Muyun. She wanted to stop, but she couldn't stop the pen in her hand. Every stroke reminded her of the time when she was young, when she would lie on the table and draw him every day. After so many years, she still remembered how he looked when he was young. When she finished the last stroke, a teardrop fell on the paper, blurring the lines and blurring her eyes. Cher closed her eyes and covered them with her hand. She seemed to have returned to the past and became that little girl again. Back then, she had an older brother, but now she didn't. She had completely lost him. What caused her to lose him? Was it Qin Mu and Zhou Chengwang? Or was it because of her illness from the serious injury? She almost couldn't survive that illness. Ishu's appearance allowed her to survive, but it also caused her to lose Yi Muyun forever. She curled up and cried, thinking that she was too greedy. So she hurt him. She cried herself to sleep, clutching the sketch tightly in her fingers. Late at night, Lan Yu quietly walked out of the guest room. He walked to the sofa and saw her curled up figure, as well as the tear stains on her face. Bending over, he took the sketch from her fingertips. Unsurprisingly, he saw a handsome face and high spirits on it. The 20-year-old Yi Muyun. Lan Yu's unfathomable eyes carried a touch of coldness. He looked at it quietly, and a faint smile floated on his lips. The 20-year-old Yi Muyun was enough to make every young girl fall in love with him. Indeed, he had the capital. However, he had only ever seen Tang Shui. No one else. Lan Yu's eyes were cold. After a long time, he placed the paper on the table and bent down to touch Cher's lips. His voice was gentle. "It's been so long, and you still haven't forgotten him? Cher was in a deep sleep and didn't wake up. He kissed away her tears bit by bit and murmured, "Good night." And there was an indescribable gentleness in his eyes, but the gentleness was fleeting, as if he was looking at someone else through Cher. There were too many secrets hidden in Lan Yu's eyes. He straightened his body, reached out to carry her horizontally, and walked towards the master bedroom. When she and Ishu lay side by side, Xiao Ishu immediately rolled in her arms and hugged her like a little pig. Lan Yu's eyes were filled with warmth. He lowered his head and kissed each of their foreheads before leaving the room. He did not sleep. Instead, he smoked for half the night in the living room. He looked at the dark night outside, and his gaze was slightly tense. After 5 years, he had finally waited for this day. However, he was not as ecstatic as he thought he would be. It seemed that something had deviated from the track. He had become, as if he cared too much. Lan Yu stood there for the whole night, and it was not until the next morning that he washed away the smell of cigarettes and woke the two of them up. The darkness from last night was long gone, and he was back to being the gentle Lanyu. Cher watched as he carried Xiao Yishu to brush her teeth. She scratched her hair and woke up. Suddenly, she recalled something, and her expression changed slightly. She shouted in the direction of the bathroom, "Lanyu, were you the one who carried me back to the bedroom?" She held her breath after she asked that question. About 10 seconds later, he replied, "Yes, don't fall asleep on the sofa next time." His tone was indifferent, as if there was nothing to be unhappy about. Chapter 2250. Meanwhile, Cher ran into the living room and saw the painting she had drawn lying on the table. She picked it up and was about to throw it away when Lanyu leaned against the door and said calmly, "Why do you want to throw it away? It's a good painting." Snow abruptly raised her head to look at him. Then, she coughed awkwardly. "I'm not too satisfied. The lines are smooth. Have you painted it many times?" His tone was still calm, as if he was discussing it with her in the past, without any personal feelings. Cher pursed her lips and flattened the painting with her fingers. She looked down and said, "I won't paint it again in the future." Lanyu didn't say anything else and went back to the bathroom to brush his son's teeth. She knew that he wasn't satisfied with her performance. He told her that they could be husband and wife in name only, and she could leave. But she couldn't be half-hearted in a marriage. Cher shook her head and threw the painting away in the end. She looked at it for a while when she threw it into the trash can, and her eyes were a little wet. Lanyu took her and Xiao Yishu back to the Lan family. Contrary to what she thought, the Lan family wasn't a scholarly family, but a business family. The famous Grand Hyatt Hotel was actually owned by the Lan family. Lanyu's parents were also very easygoing. They must have known about Cher and Xiao Yishu's appearance, so they didn't look surprised and even gave them a generous gift. Cher accepted it with a guilty conscience. She looked up at Lanyu, who was playing chess with Mr. Lan. He looked at her calmly and said, "Since Mom gave it to you, just accept it." Cher said, "Oh," and accepted the gift. In order to welcome them back, Mrs. Lan cooked in person. Cher couldn't just sit there and do nothing, so she immediately ran over to help. Father Lan gave birth to a son and smiled lightly. "The person you've chosen isn't bad." Lanyu looked in the direction of the kitchen and smiled. "You're so stupid. It's good that Mom isn't angry." Father Lan remained calm and composed. "It's been so many years. You only brought the child home when she's already so big. Lanyu, don't you think too highly of her? Furthermore, she's still a daughter of the Tang family." Mr. Lan then asked meaningfully, "Don't you care about power?" Lanyu raised his eyebrows and looked at his father with an indecipherable look. Man in power, Yi Muyun wants the same. Mr. Lan was also a veteran in the business field, so he said with certainty. Lanyu is non-committal. Dad Lan continued, "I've heard rumors about Boyi." "Lanyu, are you sure you want to get involved?" Lanyu looked up. "Dad, do you want me to get involved?" "If you don't care, Cher doesn't care about Boyi, and we don't care about material things, you don't have to get involved." Mr. Lan made it clear. The marriage was a done deal. The child was already so big. What else could he do? Moreover, his grandson was so cute. How could Mr. Lan give up? Lanyu pursed his lips and looked at his father. After a long time, he said calmly, "I know. I'll do my best." Getting Boyi was the first step. The second step was probably to deal with the Lan family. The third step was to force Lanyu to give up his wife. That was probably Yi Muyun's plan. Mr. Lan nodded in agreement. "It's good that you're open-minded. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.